Hi patrons, for this week, since the main video on YouTube is sort of more about how you think about things and how you plan your practice and not so much stuff that we can really dig into, then I thought that would be a perfect excuse to just do some more bebop line writing, because I think it's pretty much always fun to do and you can really go into it. And I also think that there are some things that we can take with, especially sort of the Barry Harris material, and then just start developing on that and putting our own take on it in there as well. And I think that's a huge part of what you should be doing with that material anyway. It's like he's giving you all these ideas and not even rules, but just methods for creating things, and then you have to work on getting creative with it. And I think maybe it's useful to do that, especially if we want to work on adding larger intervals and changing direction in the melody and stuff, because that's usually what makes the bebop lines much more interesting. So that's what I'm going to focus on. There are a few tricks. I'm going to combine a few things from his teaching and also from what I've talked about in other videos in some 2-5-1 lines, and then just show you how that works. Some of this is like stuff that I've sort of reduced the other way around from solos that I've transcribed, one from Jesse van Ruller and I think another one from a Benson. So there's some of that as well, but it is also sort of tying into sort of this Barry Harris way of thinking. So I'm going to do all of this on a 2-5-1 in B flat major, so just C minor 7, F7 to B flat major 7. And maybe let's just first go over the first example. So probably with this you can recognize some of the building blocks that I'm using here. On the C minor 7, a pivot arpeggio of an E flat major 7 arpeggio, so, and then just a scale one with the leading note, just taking me to that A on the F7. So notice that I'm not always using, I guess if you were to use the Barry Harris chromatic scale, then you would have done something like this, sort of in the way that he uses it in the exercise. But of course you can use other notes, and of course you can go below and take that leading note as well, and he does that as well, I think. So that's what I'm doing here. And then we get the arpeggio from the third of F7. So I'm just sustaining the A, running up the arpeggio, which is then A half diminished. And then here I need to go from the G, and then I want to resolve to the D. The way I'm doing that is that first going to the F, so, and then I could have done like this, which is actually similar to what I did going from C minor 7 to F7. But in this case, I actually turned that around, so I'm going from the F down to the D flat. And that means that really what you have here is a D and then an enclosure. And this is something I talked about before. Sometimes it's super useful to turn around the enclosure to get that interval skip in there. That just makes the line a lot more melodic and interesting compared to. And that's what I'm using here. And actually, this can be used on pivot arpeggios as well. So that's something I'm going to get to in 2 examples, I think. So that's one way of using the pivot arpeggio. But you can, of course, also use pivot arpeggios to combine different arpeggios. So on the C minor 7, 2 arpeggios that work really well together would be G minor and E flat major. And if you combine those in a 2-5-1 line, then you get something like this. So here I'm playing first the G minor arpeggio, but then as a pivot arpeggio. So first the G, and then skipping down and doing the rest of the arpeggio. So, and that's just a nice variation. I think you've seen me use this line before, which you can find. I think I learned it from Kurt Rosenwinkel, but I've also found it with Charlie Parker, and I think he might have gotten it there actually. So, but then the pivot version of that, and then the E flat major 7 arpeggio. So that's that combination. Then the F7. So that's just an enclosure of the A again, but starting on the C, and then just running down and combining different chromatic notes to get to the A simply. And then from the A, you could actually look at this as being like me running down the arpeggio, so like this, and then using octave displacement. So I think that's a useful way of looking at it. It's not really something that you can call a pivot arpeggio. So in this case, it's probably better just to describe it as octave displacement. But you can use the same idea here that I used with that enclosure in the first example, but then on the G minor arpeggio, and that gives you this really nice intervallic phrase that's still just an arpeggio and still makes sense. So check this out. So here, the first part of this is pretty much the same as the previous example, except now I'm not playing this G minor arpeggio as a pivot arpeggio in the beginning. I'm turning that around so that I'm skipping around in intervals anymore a little bit more, and it still kind of works. That's the nice thing about it. So, and then of course I'm turning the E flat major 7 into a triplet and then adding a leading note to get to the C. But for the rest, that's really the same thing. And I think this way of playing a pivot arpeggio is a really nice one to get in there. Of course, it only works if you're actually going for that note, right? So you kind of need to actually aim for this one. But then it works all the time. You'll see a few other examples of how it works as well. And here on the F7 then, because I'm coming out on the C, I'm actually going down and then sort of just turning with this chromatic note. And there's not something I do a ton, but I thought it was just a nice variation of it. You will see me do that with where I use it more like the previous Patreon extras. We had the... I think I added... No, actually I was just using this one. And with that one variation that I do is to go... that's something I took out of the Doug Rainey solo that I also made a video about a few years ago. So this kind of thing, and that's also what's kind of happening here. So because for the rest, I wouldn't usually in a bebop line have these chromatic leading notes that are sort of just leading back to where I just was. That's not really how bebop works. Bebop has more forward momentum, but here it kind of works, I think. And then I'm coupling that with another example of just that octave displacement, and then a chromatic enclosure similar to the first example, except now it's not turned around. And the reason why I'm not turning it around here is also because it's already skipping around really a lot. So the need to get these interval skips, the effect of it is not going to be as strong. So that's why I'm not doing that. So, and then just ending with D and B flat. But of course, you can do a lot more with this. Let's look at some other examples where I'm using this way of using the pivot arpeggio, where it sort of becomes this, I don't know, turnaround pivot arpeggio or intervallic arpeggio melody, whatever you want to call it. That's not really a name for it, but you can at least create a line like this one. So this one is pretty simple, and it's also nice to have something that's maybe not as complicated and pretty clear for once. So I'm starting just with an enclosure of the C on the C minor. So, and then I'm really just playing that C minor 7 arpeggio to take me to the F7, but then using this turnaround pivot trick. And that's just giving me this melody where I'm going for that A, then an octave displacement, and then this melody, which you can, like, to get to the B flat major 7, you could call that like a Barry Harris half step thing, but yeah, or a scale one. It's kind of like however you want to see it. That's going to be more often the case that there are many ways to describe something. Is it a Barry Harris chromatic scale exercise? Is it an enclosure? It's a bit gray area there where what is what. That's really open to how you hear it, I think. So, and it's nice just to have something that's not really using a lot of chromaticism all the time, but also just some basic, simple melodies that are moving to chord tones and still make sense. Let's have a look at another version of this. So here I'm using 2 pivot arpeggios, and then the last one is turned around, just to illustrate that you can also do this on the F7, that there are of course some ways that works as well, because mostly it was on the C minor 7 until now. I guess in a way it's also weird that I'm actually just talking about Barry Harris and also the 2 chord, but I'm always doing that, so that's how it is. Here I'm starting with just 2 chromatic phrases from the G down to the E flat, so really just a chromatic run. Then you get that pivot arpeggio, the first one, which is just E flat major 7 again. So, and then of course that comes out on the C, which is nice and handy for the F7 here. So, and then you get another sort of enclosure, typical enclosure melody for major chords, especially dominants. And then that becomes the first note in the next pivot arpeggio. So in fact, in this case, the pivot arpeggio is starting on the root, of course. So that's A, so it's an A half diminished arpeggio. And then I'm going down to the C, and then up to the G, and down to the E flat. So again, getting this sort of intervallic skipping around, and then resolving that to F and D on the B flat major 7. So those are a few examples of how you can use this idea of turning around things within the lines, as long as they still resolve to the right place. I think it's really sort of combining that way of thinking and then target notes to get those right kinds of moves within the melodies, that they still make sense. And in this case, I'm mostly doing that with the pivot arpeggios. But I think that is a great thing to just get more out of that material. The same as what I talked about last week with just adding this lower 6 interval instead of a chromatic half step in between 2 notes, just to break up the line and make it more interesting. And it is really, like, the more I play through Parker solos and check that out and listen to it, it is those kind of things that really sort of catch my ear, at least in terms of what makes that interesting. And the way you develop this in your own playing is definitely to just not play my lines, but just really try to take the concept that I'm talking about and then try and use that, try and make your own lines with it. And don't worry about the fact that you have to make 20 lines of it before it starts to sort of become something that you can easily use. I think you kind of need to get to the point where you can easily construct a line with this and make it sound good, and then you can start using it in your playing. I think that's kind of a part of that process also, to be able to hear it, because it is much more difficult to hear than just a scale run with a chromatic leading note or something like that. There's a reason why stuff like bebop scales gets practiced really a lot, because it's fairly easy to hear. But the reason why it's easy to hear is also because it's fairly predictable in terms of the melodies that you get from it. And that also means that it makes it less genius than a Charlie Parker line. So that's also something you kind of want to be aware of, I think, with stuff like this. And putting time into just being good at coming up with solid lines like this is definitely something that pays off. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, or actually also just suggestions for other stuff I should dig into similar to this, because as you can tell, I think it's kind of fun, then let me know about that on Patreon. And for the rest, thank you for your support, and until next week.